Yes, of course. Hello, everyone, and welcome. So the first meeting or the first talk will be around recruitment, actually. And I would like to introduce Nerea and also Belen, that are part of Adevinta. So basically, they are part of the recruitment team, and they have prepared something very cool for all of us. Nerea, Belen, are you here?
Hello.
Hello.
Ready to start?
Yes.
Go for it.
Hello. So very nice to be here with all of you. My name is Belen, and I'm here with Nerea.
Yes. Hello.
So we are both working in HR as talent advisors. In my case, I've been working in Adevinta since the beginning of this year, since February, more or less. And as I said before, I'm working as talent advisor for different areas here in Adevinta, such as finance and strategy, CIO, and a couple of IT ones.
Yeah, so I'm Nerea. I'm part of the talent advisor team as well in Adevinta. In my case, I work previously in a consultancy firm, also within IT, and now I'm managing several of our IT and product tribes in Adevinta Hub or central function. So really nice to meet you. What we are going to do today is we have prepared a role play with the normal situations we can find when doing an interview, a technical interview, how to perform better in it. So in my case, I'm going to play the role of a security engineer working in a company different from Adevinta, who has been rejected in the final stage of a recruitment process.
And in my case, I'm going to play the role of a security engineer working at Adevinta.
So let's start. Hi, Belen. How are you? How are things going at Adevinta?
Hi, Nerea. It's going well here. What about you? How are things going with the active job search?
Well, I've been involved in a recruitment process for a company, and I was in the final stage, super motivated to get the role. But yesterday they called me from HR to actually let me know that they won't be considering me for the role.
But why?
Well, they told me I was perfect from a technical perspective, but that I didn't fit with the culture of the company. And what worries me the most is that this is not the first time that it happens to me.
Okay, that's interesting. As a manager in Adevinta, I've been trained to make interviews, not only to check the technical part of the candidates, but also to be able to guide the candidates throughout the interview in everything related to soft skills and communication. For us, this has been a great improvement in the process because we can test if the person is a good fit for the company.
Sounds great. Can you help me with some tips? I really felt I was a good candidate for the role I was applying for, and I would really appreciate if you could give me some advice.
Of course. Have you identified what is your pain point when doing an interview?
Let me think. I think I'm not the best in communicating what I really want to say. For example, I always wait for the interviewer to ask me questions, and I usually give short answers because if the interviewer needs to know more details about me, I guess he would ask me, right?
Okay. Anything else that comes to your mind?
Actually, yes. With all this COVID situation, I realized that I'm not 100% confident when doing video interviews as well.
Okay, then let's talk about these two topics, if it's fine for you. The first one, how to improve communication when doing an interview. And the second one, how to feel more confident when doing a video interview.
Great.
Okay, so bear in mind that when you are interviewed, you normally have 30 to 60 minutes, to explain all your professional experience. This is such a short time, so you really need to try to make an impact on the interviewer. In Adevinta, we've been trained on how to succeed in the soft skills part of the interview.
Okay, sounds good, but give me some tips, please.
Okay, for example, when answering a question, you should have in mind the STAR method. It is an invert triangle that involves what you need to cover when explaining something. You have to bear in mind situation, tasks, action, and result. This way, you will give the interviewer all the relevant information about a specific capability that the job requires.
Okay, let's try. Let's imagine you are the interviewer and ask me a question, please.
Okay, so could you please describe a situation in which you had to work as a team?
Yes, I will try to use the STAR method. Give me a couple of seconds to think because I was not prepared.
Right, okay.
So, therefore, using the STAR method, I should give a situation, task, action, and result. So my answer would be situation. In my current company, 1 year ago, the team lead left the company and there was a huge restructuration in the team, giving us the chance to decide whether to work in a squad or individually. So task here would be, Adevinta was developing a huge project to be able to detect different threats in the runtime of the operating system. It is a complex project due to the amount of marketplaces and different teams that are part of the company and the volume of information that would be transmitted to different systems, among others. Therefore, we had many different technical challenges to overcome. Action would be, as it was a huge project, in my opinion, the best way to handle it was working in a team, as we can all contribute in different ways inside the squad, and we all had the same goal in mind. And as a result, I would say, after working hard for almost 8 months, the project was a complete success, and I know it is thanks to the organization we made when we created this security squad.
Okay, that's great, Nerea. With this example, I guess you've noticed that the interviewer receives a much more completed answer than just saying, yes, I prefer working on a team. You should practice this for your next interviews. I'm sure it will really help you.
Great. So this could be an example. You can really use it every time that you face an interview, because we can both talk about our technical skills, but also we need to demonstrate that we are team players, that we are proactive, that we have different soft skills needed for the role, right? So
I don't know if you've ever seen this triangle before, or if you have previous experience using it, but it is very, very helpful when doing an interview because you give all the information that the interviewer may need. The situation, what was the situation, so the interviewer can understand what was happening. The task, what was the problem or the issue at hand. The action, what did you do? You have to focus in your performance doing that when dealing with that problem, with that situation, and also the result. What was the result? What did you learn? This is what normally, when we make interview, this is what really interests us.
Exactly. And thinking about, okay, what can I prepare for an interview? It's really useful that if you read the job description, you can find different things that are going to be evaluated in the interview, right? Not only from the technical part or perspective, but also from this soft skills part. And sometimes this is what makes the difference between really two good candidates, technical candidates, right?
Mm-hmm. Also, bear in mind that now that everyone's doing video interviews, we need to try to share all the information we want to share with the interviewer, and this is a great way to do it with this STAR method. So if you have any doubt, if you have any questions, now maybe we cannot handle many questions right now, but you can always add us in LinkedIn and we can try to help if you need it, for sure. I don't know if anyone has any question right now.
Thank you for the role play. I think I have one actually, because the STAR method is very good for preparing or to be prepared for an interview. But the first question that I have is, what is a common mistake that a candidate does during the hiring process? What are your thoughts about this?
Yeah, it comes to my mind at least two, which are sometimes candidates don't look at the company business. They don't know what the company does. They just focus on, okay, what technologies are described in this job description? Can I be attracted to it or not? But it's really important that we know what the company does and what are the values of the company, because if you can find this in every company's webpage, and if you see, for example, that one of their core values is teamwork, for sure this is going to be something the interviewer is going to take into account when talking with us, right? And the second thing that comes to my mind would be actually what I just said. Read the job description, focused on the technical part, of course, but also in trying to figure out which competencies and soft skills are going to be evaluated, right? And try to frame them and to prepare them with this STAR method, and always giving real examples of them, right? Real specific examples instead of hypothetical behaviors that we can have in the interview.
Also, I would add that as an interviewer, we always want the candidate to make questions. This is a mistake that is very often when doing interviews, when the candidate doesn't ask any question at the end of the interview. As we said when we were doing the role play, we normally just have like 30-60 minutes to prove ourselves to the interviewer that we are just the great fit for the company. So it is important to ask as many questions as you may have, because it is also a way of demonstrating to the interviewer that you've been checking about this company, that you've read many times the job description, that you have a real interest in joining this company. So please don't hesitate in asking as many questions as you may have, because that's when doing an interview, that's the moment when you have to do it.
Exactly. That could be, Mariano. I hope we answered your question.
Yes, actually you did. Thank you so much for that. But I think that from the chat, I am not able to see any question from the people that joined our streaming session. So it seems that we have to prepare for the next speaker. So for now, I will just say thank you for your lovely presentation. Hopefully, I can be more prepared for my next interview for Adevinta, but for a different position maybe. Thank you so much for your lovely presentation. Now we will have to move to another speaker, actually. So Godha, I think that you will need to present your screen and we will have some delay on the streaming. But Godha, if you could please share your screen so we can see your slides, and then I will start introducing you.
Sure, thank you, Mariano.
Okay, that's good. Meanwhile, the next speaker will be Godha. She will be presenting security-related topics, actually, which is related to MITRE for enterprise, and for sure we will see or we will hear a lot of cool security stuff. So Godha, if you are ready, you can go for it.
Are you able to see my screen, Mariano?
No, not really. So you will have to share it again.
Okay, now?
Now, yes.
Yes?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Okay, please let me know if you can't see, because I won't be able to see the the chat. Okay, thank you, and thank you to Women in Security Barcelona and Adventa for inviting me here today to give this talk and share my thoughts from the field of security. Today, I want to share a really exciting framework that MITRE released in September, I think. And as you may be familiar with the MITRE ATT&CK framework, this newest one actually tries to put together the enterprise attack framework and the industrial security critical infrastructure framework together into a one big hybrid visual. And it looked really cool. So I thought when Mariano, you reached out to me for a talk, I thought we should definitely share and talk about this. So that's the plan for today. We move on. I just wanted to share a little bit about myself. And I mentioned here, I'm just another regular girl pushing through the patriarchy. Now, as you know, a lot of industries are heavily male-dominated. That's just the way our society was formed to begin with. But then even security is no different. I started off very early, back in the 90s, when I was pretty young or younger. I wanted to become an astrophysicist, so I studied physics and electronics. And like I say here, jokingly, that mission never launched. So I ended up in computer science because, people told me you can make a lot of money in computer sciences. So I jumped in. But computer sciences was very, very exciting. I did have a diploma in computer science and engineering, so it was really, really exciting for me to start working in the field. I started off with Unix and C. The Unix I found to be one of the very fabulous operating systems as a young person starting out in the field, and I fell in love with it, and I stuck with it for a really long time. And also I started learning a lot of other, in those days, we had several third generation and fourth generation programming languages, none of which we talk about too much these days. And I also say that, I witnessed the birth of Google, Java, XML, and so on and so forth. So it was very interesting times. I sometimes miss those days. I got into security back in 2000 through a project in cryptography, and I really fell in love with the field. So I decided to stay on and never moved out of the field till date. In fact, I've sort of changed my dimensions and increased my scope in the field of security. So a few years ago, I decided to take a break from my career, my corporate job that I had been for more than 2 decades. And I decided to get a degree in economics and get an international security focus. Because I felt that security did have a much wider and broader impact than we typically talk about in the field of cybersecurity. Right now, I do advocate for cyber peace and, of course, international security. And I mentor women and youth to embrace the STEM fields and embrace cybersecurity. And there are a lot of things to do in cybersecurity beyond hacking. So please explore the field as an umbrella area. There's a lot to do, and we need you. A very brief disclaimer, I am not affiliated to any product or tool or vendor. So anything I say today, please don't take it as an endorsement. As I say here, I really like technology because it is an enabler. So I admire any tool that makes our life that much easier for us. So here's how I plan to do it. Very quickly, we'll look at the MITRE Hybrid Visual that I mentioned to you earlier. Now, I don't intend this to be a deep dive presentation, but I wanted to introduce the visual to you. And then I'll tell you a little bit about how to use the visual if it's something new that you haven't used before, but also bring attention to the aspect of industrial security, because I really do now care about industrial security as a matter of national security, as a matter of international security and peace. So it becomes really important for all of us to understand how industries work and what security means to industries and why it is important even to us as common people. There's also a very important thing that I like to talk about is something called as interconnected risks. I tend to think in a very I'm a very visual thinker, so I tend to think in graphs. I tend to visualize different patterns, and I can quickly connect different things in a very broad context, from a big picture to even to the fine details. So I want to share a little bit of that perspective with all of you. So I say, let's not think in linear mode that, if this happens, then this happens. Instead, we really need to think all of the different interrelated, complex connections that we have in our world that can impact what we do and what happens as a result. So this is what I say, interconnected risks. So I would like to share something about that one as well. So let's get started. The attack framework, now MITRE trademarked this term, and I really like their framework as someone from the field. It stands for Adversarial Tactics, Techniques, and Common Knowledge. So as you can see in the acronym, it's sort of a taxonomy that helps us understand what are the different tactics that adversaries use and what are the different techniques that they use. And MITRE's idea was to provide us a sort of a holistic view and this common body of knowledge so that all of us as security professionals have a common platform to look at problems from and the vocabulary and the terminology that we use. So that's pretty much what attack framework is, but it is really useful. Initially, it used to be quite helpful for red team exercises in offense and defense exercises. But then over the years, the framework has really matured, and the industry has also matured in the way we use MITRE's attack framework. So instead of just using it for learning the offense tactics and techniques and learning the blue team's tactics and techniques, we are now using it almost like a cyber threat intelligence platform, a framework for understanding how cyber threats look, what happens, what are the implications, and how we can in a common way share this information with each other so we can build a more resilient community. So the use is really maturing over the years, and that's why I think it's a really nice framework to look at if you're in the field of security or cyber threat intelligence. So here's what they have so far. They have a pre-attack framework. They have an enterprise framework. As you can see, they have different versions for it. Also, they have the cloud frameworks. They have something for mobile. And like I said, they recently released something for the industrial network. And this is a first glimpse into how the framework actually looks. So this is from what they call as the Navigator. It's an online platform. So the slide decks that I have here, I think it'll be shared as part of the presentation, but it has all the links there. So if you go to mitre.org's website, you'll look at the Attack Navigator. You can actually drill down to each of the techniques and tactics that they have listed in the format, and you can really explore the different aspects of it. So I don't intend to go down deep diving into each of these things, but it's for you to go explore. And my intention is to sort of inspire you to look at this as one of the important tools in your toolkit for security defense. This is also one of the ways in which you can look at the framework. It's a flat description that you can look at everything in one slide. So I thought it'll be interesting to see. So you can see it goes from left side to the right side. So you go from initial access to the impact. That's how you move across this matrix. And here you go. This is the ICS, the hybrid visual that I mentioned that they released very recently. And you'll see that the blue areas are the interlapping areas between the enterprise and the ICS. And to the extreme right, you'll see the gray shaded areas are the ones that are specific to ICS, to the industrial security areas. And all of the white, the unshaded ones are for the enterprise. Now, why did they do this? I think this is very important to answer that question. They put together an enterprise framework, I think back, I don't remember the exact timeline of it, but then they put together a separate one for ICS because obviously industrial security, industrial cybersecurity is gaining a lot more prominence and importance. So this was back in January, I think, when they put together the ICS framework. And then more recently, they felt that there are a lot of areas of overlap where the enterprise attack framework does not cover how an adversary goes from the IT systems to the operational systems in the industries. So with FireEye, MITRE sat together and built this hybrid visual to say, okay, we really need to look at the entire landscape in a holistic way. We need to know what happens when an adversary moves between an industrial landscape and goes into an enterprise, or comes from an enterprise, goes into an industrial landscape. So what are the points of overlap? What are the points of departure? And this is what the visual tries to do for us. So I highly recommend taking some time to understand, take a deep dive into the visual and see what it does for your security teams, whether you're part of the red team exercises or the blue team exercises. And I know that today in the rest of the talks, we have some more exciting talks coming in these areas. So as you take part in the later presentations as well today, please do keep MITRE framework at the back of your head and see how the framework sits on top of everything that we're talking today. So it's definitely a useful tool. So here I say how to use it. Like I said, tactics, they are why adversaries do things. Techniques are how they do things. So say, for example, if you look at the top gray shaded ones, those are the tactics. You go from left to right, from initial access to impact ICS. And the techniques are the individual items that you see on the matrix. So techniques are how adversaries do something. Yeah, and the whole intention is to provide a sort of a periodic table of an adversary behavior, a mindset of the hacker or of the defender. And it's important to note that, and obviously an adversary will not use every tactic that is listed on the MITRE's framework. That's not the intention of the framework. But then you can really use the tactics and techniques presented here in a sort of combination to understand how the mindset of an attacker behaves, so that then you can do a counter defense or offense depending on how they move. So that's really important to note that. Typically, adversaries would like to use minimum tactics and get maximum outcomes out of it. And most importantly, leave as least trail as possible, because obviously they don't want to get caught. Yes, but then we can, as let's say if we are on the defensive team, then we can also counter these operations by looking at what they're trying to do. And although they try not to leave a trail, we all know that hackers always do something stupid and leave a trail for us to get them. So here we go. That's how we can really prepare ourselves by getting more and more familiar with the attack framework. And this is not the only frameworks. There are a lot of other tools we can use, but I do think that it gives us a really good starting point in a very compact way to look at the whole landscape of attack, offense, and defense in one picture, in one table. You may be familiar with the cyber kill chain, the Lockheed Martin cyber kill chain. We do talk about it a lot, but we have to remember, if there's a question, so how is it different from a kill chain? Well, the kill chain, as it indicates in its term, it refers to a sequence. But the MITRE ATT&CK framework talks about the different steps an adversary may take in order to achieve the goal that they want to achieve. So that's one of the important difference that you have to remember between what a cyber kill chain and what the MITRE ATT&CK framework is, and how to use or complement both in your work. This is another picture that I would like to share. Is please remember that the industrial network is very different compared to our enterprise network. So typically in an enterprise, you divide your network. Hopefully it's not a flat network, because this is one of the biggest things that in my around 25 years of consultancy I've seen. We keep saying the same thing over and over again. Zone your networks, divide your networks, segment your networks. You all may also, experience these things, repeating these things. Yet we find situations where the network is flat, and people are able to escalate from one point to another point and navigate easily in the network without any challenge or opposition. And that's one of the biggest problems in an industrial network. So this is the Purdue's reference architecture model. So the ICS architecture is divided here. If you look at it, it's sort of divided into 6 layers, and the level 0 is the most crucial one, because that's where operations happen. This is where your chemicals are mixed, your sewage treatment plant works. This is where the main thing happens. And then the level 1 is where it controls the safety of the equipment, when it needs to discontinue, when it needs to disconnect. All of that comes under level 1. So as you can see, as you go above the level, the operations in an industrial network changes. And the topmost, the level 4 and 5, is where we start going into our enterprise networks. This is how you can now take that MITRE ATT&CK framework, lay it on top of this, and see how adversaries would potentially move from one level to another level, and what happens in that navigation, and what are the different techniques they use to gain control and access to what they want to. Now, interesting. Why should we bother about all these things? And you may have heard about something called as the Industry 4.0. So I wanted to put this slide together to help you ask that question. What's the big deal? The big deal is that we are unfortunately trying to retrofit really advanced mindset onto something that was not designed to be so advanced. So if you look back into history, the way we started back in the 18th century, if you go to look at the first revolution, industrial revolution, things were purely mechanical. Yes, and then in the second revolution, we started adding technology to it. So we had electricity, then we had mass production, and that's also where a lot of automation started coming into being. The first roots of automation due to industrialization. In the third revolution, we discovered electronics, and then we discovered IT systems, and we started adding a lot more functionality and a lot more efficiency to our factories and industries. What we are in today now is truly phenomenal, and it has the potential to give humanity a lot of benefits and a lot of progress. But there are challenges. We are trying to digitalize our systems, but remember, these were legacy systems. These are systems that were designed in the past where we did not think about AI and ML. And we're trying to make these systems smart now by bringing in sensors and the IoT and IIoT and all of these fancy terms that we use now that's out in the industry, the jargons. So we're trying to add on smart onto legacy systems, which means there will be gaps because these systems were not designed to live in the new world. And that's why it's such a big challenge. So we really have to pay attention to how things were designed in the past. And we have to remember that it may have been a feature in the past, but it could become a bug today. So what is our feature today? Please remember, it could also become a bug 5 years later. So it's not to say that it was wrong what they did in the past. It was just fit and perfect for what the situation was in the past. But it now needs to adapt. Yes, and that's why security becomes an important dimension that we need to think about in every task that we do across every industry. And that's why it matters. So industrial security, well, there are several terms you'll come across. You have critical infrastructure, you have information infrastructure, and then you have the CBRN is chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear industries. So there are several terms that you may encounter when you're talking about industrial security. So here's an example of how ICS looks for Spain. So you've got all these industries, the transport, water, space, research, supply chain, health, ICT. These are all examples of what ICS means to Spain. For every country, the definition of ICS will slightly vary depending on what they have decided to include or exclude in their focus area for ICS. Yeah. So if you're from a different country and not from Spain, you might want to Google up for your countries what are the critical infrastructures for your country, and it's pretty easy to find on your national websites. Again, very important point that I wanted to bring to our attention is that at the root of all this, we have people. Yes, and then we have process and technology. These three together, the three forces together, can cause an impact. If something happens in one or the other facets, it causes some impact to all of the three. And that's why I wanted to put this graphic together to say, well, these are the basic components in ICS. You've got some protocols that tell it how to talk with each other, different systems. You've got proprietary softwares or operating systems. And then you've got the specific hardware, the bespoke hardware for each of these industries, depending on what industry it is. The hardware can be different, and so will the software. You've got the whole support system around the industry, and that also varies heavily. And the knowledge base are the people who are required, the engineers, the workers who are required in order to support this system. So you have to remember, with legacy systems today, unfortunately, maybe we are losing a lot of this engineering knowledge in our modern education system. That could actually become a serious gap, because just imagine if something happens in one of these legacy industries and we don't have resources or the knowledge to fix those problems. That's a big gap for us. And that's why it's really important to try and think about security in a very broad perspective. You have to think about the industry, the society in which you're living, and how it impacts you. Not just think of cybersecurity in one mindset, oh, I want to get into cybersecurity, I'll do ethical hacking. That's not the single track that we should think about. There are so many interesting things to do with cybersecurity. And I mention here that, of course, cybersecurity is definitely different between IT and ICS. In ICS, please remember that availability and integrity are most important, rather than the typical CIA triad. Okay, am I still good on time, or how is it going, Mariano, with time?
We are going perfect, no worries.
Okay, please don't hesitate to ping me if we need to stop, yeah? Okay, so sorry, to come back to this slide, the most important point to take away from this slide is that please remember that in an industrial security, the difference between ICS and IT is that we focus on safety, availability, and integrity. Only then we worry about confidentiality, privacy, and all of that stuff. So that is really important to focus on between, as a difference between the two systems of working. So if you're coming from IT security, you might find a little bit time to get used to how industrial security works. And this is the sort of the change in mindset that you need to bring. Yeah. And of course, I try to highlight that here because in my experience, I've really found that this is one of the biggest challenges that people coming from IT security, they try to bring that IT security mindset into industrial security. That really doesn't work. We really have to think specifically in terms of how industries work, how factories work, and we have to use that engineering mindset to apply security in a very different sense. Which means you have to understand risks, how risks look different for the critical infrastructure and the industrial sector. Here's what I say, you may have heard this in real estate. We say location, location, location is everything. But I would say that in cybersecurity, we have to remember now more and more, impact on human lives matters most now. Especially the COVID pandemic would have taught us this lesson that, we may have fancy stuff, nuclear missiles and this weapon and that weapon, and we spend millions of dollars on all these weapons, but without basic things like a good healthcare system with proper hand sanitizers or PPEs, just look at what happens. So sometimes it's the basic things that are really important to ensure safety and security of our people and human life. So we really have to think about security in a very holistic way, not just in a very single track and in an offensive track. It's also about building defense and resilience inside out. So I would say, please focus on your assets. And with assets, I mean, focus on your critical infrastructure. Focus on what are the most important things that you need to survive, that you need to live your life. And what are those things that are connected to the internet on the cyber realm. So I say here, our job as security professionals is to ensure safety and security in access to resources, access to information, and access to services. And I'm sure that all of you now, with the experience of COVID that we have globally, we understand how important access to resources, information, and services are really. So this is what truly matters at the end of the day. And we really have to build in security from this perspective, inside out. So let's see, a few more slides, but I don't intend to really go on in depth with every slide that I have here. I have put these slides together for to share it with all of you, and you can take a look at it later. But the bottom line is the risks, the way you look at risks between a traditional IT realm and an industrial realm is very different, as you can understand. And it is different because the impact on human life becomes real when something happens in industries. For example, if a hack shuts down a water treatment plant, just imagine what it might do to all of the water streams and all of the water supply systems that are delivered to us at homes. Yes, so we really need to pay attention and think of cybersecurity from this mindset. Like, definitely, till now, cybersecurity has not had, we may think, has not had direct impact on life. It has not killed anyone directly. We may say that, but we really have to think and question, is that true? What are the direct and indirect consequences of cybersecurity and the dangers and the threats that we face from cyber warfare? So we really have to look at the landscape again. And we have to remember that, I mentioned here this morning, I attended this virtual conference at NATO. It was actually open for everybody to attend, and I happened to, because I'm on that mailing list, I was able to attend it. It was really, really good. It was very good. It talked about women, peace, and security. It talked about why security matters. NATO's very clear, security is their business. Yes, and they also announced in the past years that along with air, space, land, and water, cyber is their new 5th domain. So we really have to think NATO has 30 members at the moment, and North Macedonia recently joined in this year. So what about all the other countries who are not part of the NATO alliance? And that's why I think this idea of building security inside out is truly important, and it's very dear to my heart as well, that we, all nations, must participate actively. All of us must participate actively in building a peaceful world, which means it begins building with capacity in our communities, and this directly means building cybersecurity capacity, and this means through education. And that's why I think institutions and organizations like WoSECxAdevinta Barcelona or Adventa, they're doing a good job by bringing all of us together from the industry and sharing such insights with each other. So this is really one of the good things to do as community. The other thing about security is, please, we have to try and understand each other's culture and geopolitics. How the world works is very important to understand how our future security and how the cybersecurity realm will work. Because now, if cyber warfare happens and it impacts industries, it's going to impact lives everywhere. So we really have to be careful and understand, what do nations want from each other? How are the relations? How is the foreign policy between nations? Because that could become the intention and the motive behind the things that happen underlying in the cyber realm. Just like wars used to happen in the past, underlying intentions and motives dictated why wars happened. Consider cyber as just another realm. The same principle will apply. So we really need to understand and pay attention to the geopolitics of the world. So as part of cybersecurity education, this is also another important thing that you can definitely look at. Again, I cannot emphasize it more, why this matters today. It matters because things like Internet of Things, they really blur this line between, remember the first industrial revolution that I showed you? Internet of Things tries to blur that line between what was electrical, what was mechanical. Today, we're trying to digitize everything. So everything that was mechanical is now going to be on the internet. So we really have to think seriously about what will be the implications of that. How does the risk landscape look like? How does the threat landscape look like? We really have to think about that. And now, no more, we can just say these are the only limited skills in cybersecurity. You can come from any field and you can still think about cybersecurity. You can still learn cybersecurity because it matters. So here are some examples of what type of cyber vulnerabilities we may face in an industrial sector. Again, my intention is not to really give you a lesson on all of these things today, but I did want to emphasize, and I hope I've emphasized it enough, that industrial security is a very different landscape. IT security is a very different landscape. And things like the MITRE framework are really one of good tools to actually help us look at this from a very high level and understand what the challenges are. How does an attacker think? Therefore, how should a defender think? Yeah. There's, of course, if you Google this up, you'll see the history of some well-known cyber attacks on industrial systems. So this is not new. And one of the other interesting things that I would highly recommend is also not just looking at the stats on some well-known attacks, but I would encourage you to please go ahead and study the anatomy of attacks. So if you Google up anatomy of cyber attack and anatomy of each of these attacks, so say, for example, anatomy of the Stuxnet, or anatomy of the black energy attack that happened on the grid. So if you Google this up, you can really study how attacks happen and then you bring the whole MITRE framework, the kill chain into perspective, it starts making sense how these tools can be used to become more resilient and better defenders of your networks. I put together this wheel of cybersecurity to show you the interrelationships of cybersecurity to our life. Cybersecurity, as you can see, impacts every aspect of our life. And it also provides us a lot of services and a lot of assurances. So it permeates every aspect of life. So it's not definitely this or that. Top risks for 2020. This was a projection. This is a really nice report, Global Risks Report from World Economic Forum. I would highly encourage you to go take a look at that and read through that report, where you can actually see the different items that may impact security in the future. Well, 2020 is the future today. So, we're already there, and you can see how this is played out. Yes. But this is the interconnected risk graphic that I absolutely love, and it is from the same report. And I really wanted to show this because this is how I think in my head about different things and about how cybersecurity impacts our lives. So remember when I told you that we cannot think linear. If this happens, then this happens, else this happens. We cannot think in that if then else mode anymore. That's linear thinking. We really have to think in multiple ways. If something happens somewhere that we don't even expect that it might impact us, how it would impact our lives here. So you have to think in not just the domino effect, but you also think, okay, what is sort of the butterfly effect of something, a small thing that happens somewhere? Does it impact my country? Does it impact my state, my location, my area, my assets? So you really have to think in this multidimensional way. And this is a nice graphic. And the links are in the presentation. So, but it shows the dependency between each of the critical infrastructure. So I thought I should share this with all of you. And here, to conclude, these are some of the books that I have read, and I found them really useful. So sometimes it's hard to say, okay, where do I start? I have done somewhat IT security, and I would like to really contribute to the field of industrial security and, be part of the defense force as a community. So where do I start? So these are some of great books that I have read, and I found them really useful. So I thought I should share these titles with you as well. Now, these are not the only ones, again, but something that can help you really get started. And I cannot, Eric Knapp's, both of these books are a couple of my top favorites. The Tyson McCulley, that's really an excellent read as well. And The Perfect Weapon by David Sanger is, it really sort of explains the Stuxnet worm in a lot more in-depth way. So please do take, if you can get these books and read through them, it's really great way to get into the field and understand why this matters. And hopefully then, this presentation will come back to you again and again, and it makes sense to you. The inspiration for this talk was this article that I had read. So as you can see, FireEye had released this on September 29th, and this article has that MITRE ATT&CK hybrid visual that put together the enterprise and the ICS adversary behaviors, and I felt it was really fabulous work, so I wanted to share this. So it's a great article. Please go ahead and read through the article. It explains why they decided to put this together. So pretty much the things that I've shared with you today in the presentation, the article really emphasizes similar things from the MITRE's perspective and FireEye's perspective. All right, so I do have appendix with a lot more details. It's, I tried to make a rich presentation so that I can leave you with a lot of data, with a lot of information, because I know presentations are never enough, the time that we have, and there's so much to share. So there's also a lot of things in the appendix. Please feel free to go through it. And hopefully this made sense to all of you. And Mariano, I am done with it for now. So if you have any questions, I'm more than happy to take it.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much for the presentation, Godha. It has been lovely. So there are some notes that I captured that caught my attention. The first one that I haven't heard since a while is the network cementation, and to not having it flat. So it's a good reminder for how we can reduce the attack surface and what things we can do. But the other thing that I liked a lot is that you touch base in the fourth revolution, right? So there are some discussions right now that the debate is like, are we in the fourth revolution or in the fifth revolution, right? So there are a lot of discussions around the internet and different people and so. But within the cybersecurity field, very few times I've heard about it. So thank you for highlighting that as well.
Thank you,
And
Maria.
the last note that I capture is related to the impact that cybersecurity could have on people. And you made me remember one of the latest cases that happened. I think it was in Germany, that due to a ransomware attack, unfortunately, a person passed away, right? So we really need to be aware that nowadays cybersecurity it's more complex than before, not only because of the system complexity, but also related to how we use technology in general and how embedded it's in within our lives, right?
That's very true. Very good point, Mariano. Actually, yes, I thank you for mentioning that. And also with things like the pandemic, we realized that without, let's say, internet connectivity or without electricity, let's say if a grid was taken down in an attack and the electricity blackout impacted hospitals, then just imagine the impact we would create literally directly on lives, on human lives. And I think very good point example you bring up there is definitely cybersecurity today does have direct impact on lives, although we may not be able to put our typical return on investment measures to it because there are a lot of intangibles in cybersecurity that we have to think about. So thank you. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. And we thought that we were changing fast, and we were talking about the VUCA, volatile, and fast changing environments, and so on. Nowadays, we are talking about exponential organizations. So yeah, we have a lot of things to debate. One question that I have, because I haven't seen anything in the chat, but the only question that I have is that I know that you are very involved in different initiatives, and one of the initiatives is diversity, the one that you are involved. So I just wanted to ask you if you have any suggestion, any advice, anything that you would like to share with the audience today in this regard.
Yes, definitely, Mariano. Thank you for asking that question as well. Actually, it's an important one. I would say, in one of my first slides, when I was telling a little bit about myself, I said I'm just another gal trying to make it through the patriarchy, if you remember that slide. But I also have to say I've been very lucky in my life as a person, a geeky, nerdy person coming up in the IT field. I've been, the only woman in almost all meetings I remember in my life. Technical meetings, yeah. So, but I have been also lucky because I've had really good men on my teams, and they have been my friends. It has never been sort of a situation, maybe rarely, but it has never been a situation where I felt that they were not helpful to me or they were sabotaging me or, some things like that. So I think in terms of diversity, it is very important that we encourage women to take STEM programs more and more. But we have to look at why they're not able to take STEM programs to begin with. And if they're taking it, what prevents them from staying in STEM and growing in STEM? So I think that is really important for us to pay attention to. And the second aspect is I call for action by good men folk, as I call them. Please mentor, I would say each one mentor one. So if you have a woman around your vicinity and you see that she is interested in technical fields, in STEM fields, or in any other sort of technology realm, take her on board, mentor her, be a friend, give her opportunities. First of all, make sure she's asking for that help. I mean, because we don't want to seem patriarchal again. So, but if we make ourselves available then it really helps for women to also feel welcome and accepted. And I would say the same thing to women as well, that, I know it's a tough world out there for us, and we are clawing our way inch by inch in every field. We have to continue our fight. Please, let's not drop that fight. But at the same time, please let us make sure that we bring our men on board and we work with them together, make them understand why this is important, why 50% of the world's population cannot be neglected in these matters. Because it matters for national security. It is important for our community. So I think that is what I would say as my message for diversity. It's both across the gender spectrum, especially, if we were to say male and female, both of us have a role to play, and both of us have to support each other and pull each other up. I hope that makes sense.
It makes a lot of sense, actually. So thank you so much for this lovely message. So I think that will be it for this presentation, and I would like to invite Roi to join us, which is the next presenter.
Thank you.
Roi is part of our security team. Actually, he's part of the red team, and today he will be discussing a very cool, interesting topic and super challenging as well, which is recon. It's a quite important step during a pen test, but also to other security activities. So are you ready, Roi?
I think so. If you can see my screen, then I'm ready.
I think so. So all yours.
Let's do it. Okay, so thank you, Mariano. This is Redcon, the approach of our security team to recon. The first thing I'd like to do is to break down the title a little bit, okay? So first things first, let's talk about recon. I'm sure that most of the people watching this already know what's recon, but let's start with that. So recon stands for reconnaissance, and it's basically gathering information about your targets. So the first question that arrives is, what information? I would say that everything that you consider useful. And useful here is a very important word, because if you gather everything, you will end up with tons of data that could hide valuable information. Okay, so you only want to get this useful information. And what are you going to do with this information? Well, basically, find the vulnerabilities or using this information to make easier to exploit vulnerabilities you already found. For instance, you can be interested in host names. You can be interested in IPs, open ports, the services running behind those open ports. And sorry a minute, because I think Mariano is telling me that there is some kind of weird sound going into the stream. So let's see if we can solve it before continuing. Mariano?
Yeah, I hear a weird noise, like somebody touching the microphone or the headset or something like that. But no worries, you can continue, right? Sorry for the interruption.
No worries. If you confirm me that everything is fine, I will continue.
Yeah, you can continue. No worries.
Okay, cool. It looks like it was the zipper. Okay, cool. So what I was saying is that, right, you want to gather information about your system, and you will use this information to find vulnerabilities or to exploit vulnerabilities you already found. And you only want useful information, okay? So the next thing in the title is that this is the approach of our security team. So I'm gonna start by talking a little bit about those aspects of Adevinta that make sense in this context. So first thing, we are talking about a very heterogeneous environment. What I mean is that our environment is heterogeneous in different aspects. First, in terms of technologies, for instance, programming languages, our engineers are using a lot of languages. We have a lot of code in Java, in Scala, in Go, in Python, Node.js, you name it. But also technologies like databases. So you will find Postgres, you will find Cassandra, streams like Kafka or Elasticsearch. You will find, for instance, also different clouds, right? We have services that are deployed in, many services deployed in AWS, but we have also services on-premise. And we also have engineers testing new components in Google Cloud. So you need to find assets in all these locations and with all these different technologies. And the number of services is huge. We're talking about hundreds of thousands or thousands of services that are continuously changing. And to define what I mean with continuously changing, I have some data I gathered yesterday. And in the next slide, you can see a chart which basically shows the number of deployments we are doing. This is data since the last 6 months. And as you can see in the numbers on the left, we are basically deploying around 2,700. We're doing around 2,700 deployments per week. And this is not all the deployments. These are only those deployments that are linked with defined repositories and CI/CD pipelines and so on. But it could happen that you have engineers, for instance, deploying test services in AWS accounts or things that are outside the CI/CD pipeline. So we can say that these numbers, these 2,700 per week, is around the 70% of the real number of deployments. So the next question is, now we know the context. Why do we need recon in this context? So basically because we want to answer some questions. First question we want to answer is, do we really know what we are running? I mean, it's very difficult to track everything you are running. And this is important because you need to know if what you are exposing is secure. And for doing that, you are probably performing security reviews, automated vulnerability scans, etc. How do you know what's your scan coverage? Maybe you think that you are scanning around the 90% of your infrastructure, and actually, this is only the infrastructure you know, but there is a lot of other stuff that you are not aware of. So one thing you can do is to rely on users. And when I say users in the context of this presentation, I mean engineers. Okay, so for our security team, our users would be engineers running one site, for instance. So you can rely on them. The information they will provide will be very good. The quality of the information will be very good, because if they, for instance, record in your systems, in your asset inventory, let's say, the services they are running, they are probably providing the most critical ones, etc. But you cannot expect them to provide everything. First of all, let's say that you start an asset inventory and you want to bootstrap it. For sure, you already have services running, so you would need to record all this. And this can be a very tedious work. If you have hundreds of services and you have to register all of them, that's not easy. So probably you need to automate the task. But you cannot expect all your users to automate it, because maybe they are focusing, or maybe not, but they will be focusing on their own roadmap, and maybe they don't have resources they can spend on automating this for you. And you could say, okay, but I can automate it for them. But then the heterogeneous part comes in. And how do you automate it if everybody is using different stuff in different cloud providers and so on and so forth? And not only that, in the best case scenario, if the users are able to do it, maybe they are not recording legacy or unknown systems. Let's put it in an example. Let's say that you had a colleague that was working on a POC, okay? And some time ago, he left the company. What then? Maybe he deployed this POC manually in a secondary AWS region where you don't usually deploy things, just because he wanted it to be isolated, not impacting other services or whatnot. You need to find these ones, because usually these ones are the most vulnerable ones. Why is that? because if you are not aware of it, for sure, you won't update this service. You maybe cannot apply new firewalling policies, etc., etc., etc. And besides that, if the infrastructure is continuously changing, it's also difficult without automations and so on to track every change. Maybe you have deployed a new version of a service that is opening to the world new endpoints. And also we need to take into account when we talk about how heterogeneous is the environment, that it's not only about the technologies, it's also about the architectures. So for instance, we can be mixing things like microservice-oriented architectures with serverless serverless services, like for instance, using AWS Lambda, things like that, with more classical architectures, like for instance, a monolith or things like that. And there is a third aspect I want to talk about, which is that our philosophy is not getting in the way of the users. We want to be transparent to them. And the best case scenario here is that they are your users without knowing it. So you are able to provide them with value without they noticing it, without having to deploy packages you provide or modifications you recommend or things like that. Okay, so now that we know the context and the rationale behind applying the recon, let's talk about the approach. And the approach is actually pretty simple. I mean, it's supported on top of two main concepts, which is simple functions and composition. And with composition, we mean chaining these functions. And we'll talk basically about three types of functions. The first one is called source. A source is basically a generator, a data generator. So, for instance, we will have a small program that gathers information, gathers data from a source. That can be, for instance, your asset inventory. It can be Shodan, it can be census, well, you name it. And you use this data you gather as an entry point to perform transformations, to augment it, to get more assets, more information. So one example could be this one, right? You have your internal asset inventory, and you basically have a source that connects to the asset inventory and retrieves all the AWS accounts. We usually connect these sources with checks or transforms. Basically, a check, what it does is to transform from one asset type to a different asset type. And this is where the actual recon happens. So continuing with the previous example, if you have AWS accounts, maybe you want to get the EIPs in those accounts. And for those that are not familiar with the AWS terminology, EIPs are just static IPs you allocate in the context of your account. Just that, static IPs, which happen to be public. Okay, so you would have this transformation that takes an array of AWS accounts, and then you assume role, you connect to each of these accounts, and you retrieve all the EIPs in there. So you are transforming from AWS accounts to EIPs. After that, you will probably have a sink. And a sink is basically the opposite to a source. It will take an input, whatever input, and it will do something with it. It can be, for instance, to send this input back to your asset inventory. So, for instance, in the example we were showing before, you have generated a number of scannable assets, and you can send them back to the asset inventory. But it could be also something like sending an alert to Slack, or writing a record in a database, or adding a message in a queue, whatever you need. So if we look at this chain, basically what we have is we have gone from the asset inventory to AWS accounts to EIPs and back to the asset inventory. We are enriching the data we already have in the asset inventory. And we are talking continuously about chaining all these pieces together. And for that, what we will define is a set of contracts. So every input, every output must follow a very specific and strict contract. And a contract is nothing more than a data structure that you use to represent the information you are communicating from one step to the next one. So in the previous example, we started with a source. A source doesn't have an input contact because it doesn't have an input. It will connect somewhere, but it would be probably an external resource, and it will retrieve data. But it will have an output contract. In this case, for instance, it could be an array of AWS accounts. In the next step, in the check, you will take something that must be compatible with this output. Again, the input contract will be the same, an array of AWS accounts. It will do some changes and generate, for instance, an array of scannable assets. And in the last step, in this sync, we have basically an input contract that must be compatible, taking scannable assets and doing whatever with them, in this case, sending them back to your asset inventory. So you can see all these small pieces, all these small programs as building blocks that you can combine together if they are compatible in terms of contracts. So for instance, we can add to the previous workflow, and we will call workflow to all this chain of steps. So we can add a new branch that can go from AWS accounts to DNS records, which happen to be also scannable assets. And again, so we are connecting the source with a different check, which is compatible because it's following the same input contract, and also has a compatible output contract with the sync we already had. So we are from AWS accounts, you go to DNS records, which are scannable assets, and we take scannable assets and send them back to the asset inventory. So now that we know what's the approach, I would like to show a demo before going further in the explanations on how we implemented this and so on. If you are familiar, for instance, with tools like Maltego, you probably say, hey, this is basically the same concept. And yeah, it's exactly the same concept. Differences come later in terms of the implementation. But it's basically a chain of transforms that you can chain, so a set of transforms that you can chain together to change from type A to type B. And then you use this data in the way you want. So let's check the demo. Okay, so basically, I will explain a bit what is happening here. I will be using a set of scripts. The first one, what it does is to set the playground for all the next steps. And what we will be using here is basically the API that our internal vulnerability scanning platform provides. For the sake of this presentation, this scanning platform will act as an asset inventory. So basically, we'll be attacking its API, and we will be modifying the assets we have and so on. So basically, we start by connecting to it using a service user. In this case, is this SecDev account. And this SecDev account, which usually would be a nominal user, has a team. Okay, like in the real world. Then every team has a set of groups of assets, a set of asset groups. Okay, and for the sake of this demo, this user with this team that we showed before will only have one group. Well, it have multiple groups, but it will only have one asset, and this asset will be an AWS account. That's why we are showing here this group that is called default global. And the asset count is 1. There is only one AWS account inside this group. Okay, so the next step is, you will see running kubectl. With this, we are forcing the execution of our discovery pipeline. And here you will see some tools that I have not explained, but we will go into that later. So the first thing that happens here is that the source gets executed. Basically, the source is going to Vulkan, is retrieving all the AWS accounts, and with these accounts, it's launching 2 discovery branches. The first one is finding EAPs, as we described before, and the second one is finding DNS records using the Route 53 service in AWS, which is basically a DNS service, a normal one. Okay. So once we do this info gathering, the last layer appears, and this layer is the sync. It has basically 2 steps that run in parallel. One is for debugging, it's basically logging what we have discovered, and the second one is sending information back to Vulkan. So now we are waiting for the last layer on the left to finish. And after that, if we check again our results, we will see that we have the same group we had before with only one asset, the AWS account, but now we have a new group that is called Redcon Global that has 34 assets. And these 34 assets are split in host names and IPs, which are the steps we use to discover new stuff. I'd like to show more about the demo and so on, but given that we had to hide all the internal information and didn't have the time to set up like a demo environment with fake data and so on, I prefer just not showing what we find and just a summary with the numbers. So this is what we saw in the demo. It's a workflow that actually matches the example we were showing before. It starts with a source. The source is chained with a check, and the check is chained with a sink. And there is a fourth component, which is called a modifier. I didn't talk about it before, but it's actually something that is very useful in real-world applications. So basically, sometimes you have checks that will generate data in a specific format. But this format maybe is not compatible with the input of the next check. So what you can do there is to add a modifier in the middle that will just adapt the format so it's compatible. And you can do other things. For instance, here what we do with this modifier is splitting the data in chunks. So you can process all these chunks in parallel. And we'll talk about that later. Of course, the demo I showed is just a demo running in our development environment with one asset and so on. And this is not the real world. This is how it looks, more or less, the pipeline, the workflow we are running in production. As you see, it has way more branches because it has to process way more information. And here you cannot see the full workflow because it's in the middle of the execution, but you get an idea of how different it will be. So let's go back to the implementation. Basically, the first thing is we are using workflows, and we have to decide how to define these workflows. For that, we use Argo Workflow. It's basically an open source project that allows you to, in a declarative way, define a workflow where you define a DAG, a directed acyclic graph, with all the dependencies between all your nodes, and it will model the workflow that will execute this DAG. In this workflow, every step is a Docker container, well, it's a container, and it will be running in Kubernetes. So it's basically an orchestrator that allows you to define how to orchestrate the system based on graphs or sequence of steps. And this is real code from that demo. This is basically part of the specification where you say that you're specifying a DAG that has a number of tasks. For instance, we have a source which will connect to Vulkan and retrieve AWS accounts. We have a modifier, which is this split S3, that depends on the source. So the source has to finish before this step being executed. And then two branches, Route 53 and EIPs, where both branches depend on the same modifier. So in order to start, they will wait for it to finish, and then they will execute their corresponding steps. So why do we want to use workflows? Well, one of the requirements we set up when we defined the project and so on was that we wanted the technology to do the hard work. So you have all these pieces that you want to, or these small programs, or these small containers that you want to wire together. And using our workflows was like a good, well, it has some benefits. Like it's very easy to wire together all these containers. And it can also apply things that you will always, or almost always need, which are parallelism and retry policies. You will need parallelism because if you are scanning a lot of assets, and remember that we are talking about hundreds of services, you will need to parallelize the work. Otherwise, it will take forever. Of course, you can do it sequentially, but it makes no sense. And you will want retry policies because if you are exploiting APIs like, I don't know, the AWS one or whatever, you can get into errors because of rate limiting, things like that. And you will want to handle those retrying usually. So you will probably have to implement some kind of exponential backup policy and things like that. And you will have to do this per step. So we thought that it's maybe better to do it on the workflow level and keep these small pieces, these small programs, the checks, the sources, the sinks, very simple. And then, as we mentioned, every step is a container. Specifically in our case, we're using Docker containers. And it's important to stress this because it comes with a set of benefits. First of all, everybody working in security, well, or in any other field, know that usually there is a library that some random guy has already written that does more or less what you need. It can be done in Python, maybe it's Ruby, maybe it's Go, whatever. The good thing about using containers is that you isolate the dependencies. So you can take this library, wire it with your code, put it inside a container and forget. Everything will be self-contained and it won't affect the rest of the components in your workflow or in your discovery pipeline. Also, it's very easy to replace these containers. We were mentioning this thing about using a random library, right? Maybe this library is not very good, but it's good enough for a POC. So just create a small program that uses the library, put it there, define very well the contracts, and as soon as you decide that the POC is valid and you want to have something better in production, you can replace this piece with another that is compatible with the input and output contract. So it's very easy to replace one component by an improved version. Also, we mentioned serverless infrastructure. At the beginning, when we were designing the system, we thought about using AWS Lambda. And at least from my side, I think that, yeah, it's cool. It's a cool technology that it has some problems, for instance, when it comes to debugging your code. So probably if you have a bug, you will end up deploying the same Lambda once and again, logging different stuff in different places in your code until you find the problem in CloudWatch or whatever. And it's kind of annoying. There isn't, or at least I don't know much about good debugging tooling for these kind of things. And the good thing is that here you can basically write your own small standalone tools. So maybe as part of your security reviews, if you are auditing many AWS accounts, you decide to write some small program that makes your life easier. It can be, for instance, if we come back to the example, a tool that goes to that account you're auditing and lists all the DNS records. So then you can add it to your scan queue and you are good to go. So, well, if you have these small standalone tools, what you can do is to put them in a container. And maybe adding a mode, one that is user-friendly and another one that is workflow-friendly in terms of taking the input with a specific format, following the contracts, and outputting or sending the output with a specific format, using a standard input, a standard output, or using an input file, an output file, whatever that suits your needs. And the good thing is that you will write it as you write any other software in your computer. You will have all your debugging tools, and I think it's quite easy to test. Well, it comes with some benefits. And the thing is that if you look at the whole picture, the things you will be coding are small programs that do one thing well. And for instance, let's say that you have one source for attacking your asset inventory. You do it once. You define some, you can parameterize it, so the output depends on these parameters. And that's it. You don't need all your security engineers to dig into the documentation to see how you have to use the API and so on. You just put this source in your toolbox, and whenever you need to exploit information from your asset inventory, you just use the source and you connect it with whatever check you want to implement or you're implementing. So at the end, after some time, you will end up with a small toolbox with a lot of sources, a lot of things, a lot of checks that you can wire together. And it's very easy to experiment. First, because it's easy to wire these components together, and once you have them, you can start deciding if this pipeline finds new assets or not really, or if it makes sense or not, and you can start playing with all that. And the good thing is that you will be focusing in those things that really add value, because, I mean, writing a library, for instance, to exploit information from the asset inventory, I mean, it's something you need, but if you can avoid it and you don't need to learn how to use it, and you just take these building blocks that have the output you need, and you create something that have the input, a compatible input, and so on, you are good to go. So for me, this is way more fun. So now we have the workflow, and we have the components that will run inside the workflow. How do we trigger it? So in the demo, we triggered it manually, as any other job in Kubernetes. But of course, you can schedule it. Maybe you want to schedule it to be executed before you run your periodic scans. Or maybe you want to listen to an event. You are subscribed to a topic, and every time you receive something, you launch the scan. Or maybe you have some kind of webhook, and every time an event happens, you launch your scan or your discovery pipeline, I mean. Or you can do things that are more fancy. I don't know, you can create maybe a Slack bot, which is waiting for messages, ordering to execute a specific kind of discovery, and when you receive that, you launch the specific workflow for that. And now that we have all this set up, we need a way to deploy it. And probably this slide here is a bit off topic, but we wanted to include it because it talks about an aspect that I consider very important, and is collaborating. So how do we deploy things inside this platform I show you? First of all, we have a repo that contains all the workflows and all these building blocks. So every time a user wants to create a new building block, the only thing they have to do is to create a folder, put the code there, a Docker file, and once you push it, it will go to Travis, which is our CI service, and we'll build the image. So we'll run the test, it will do all the stuff. Once you are happy with what you have, you can basically merge it, and this will trigger a pull request in a different repo. This repo is what we call the GitOps repo. We have decided to go through this new GitOps trend to see how well it fits our needs, and so far so good. So basically, once you are happy with your results and you have your artifacts deployed, being the artifacts, these workflows and these Docker images and so on, you can you have a new pull request in your GitOps repo that you can test. You can apply it, for instance, in the dev branch, and it will automatically get deployed into our development cluster, our development Kubernetes cluster. And this is done by Argo CD. In the same way, if you merge it to different branches and so on, it will get deployed in Pro, and so on. But what I want to stress here is that for us, it's very important to make it easy to contribute. So when we designed the platform, and we decided to go through all these small building blocks that everybody can write and can reuse and so on, what we were thinking was in something that does not require the users to read a lot of documentation, which is important, of course. Learning how to use the libraries and so on. It's more direct. It's more like, okay, I want to do a check, and this check needs AWS accounts. Do I have a source that provides me with this? Ah, yeah, you have one. Okay, I take it. I write the check. Okay, and now I want to send this as Slack messages or to the access inventory again. Do I have something that takes an input that is compatible with my output that I can reuse? Yes, you have this. And you just wire them together and you are good to go. And this is how it looks in our development environment. Basically, you have this pipeline called Redcon AWS. And for me, pipeline and workflow is the same in this context, just in case I'm using both words. And it basically deploys a cron job, which will be the one triggering the workflow, and then a secret, which is used, if I remember correctly, to access AWS accounts, it's exploiting, and so on and so forth. So now I want to show you some numbers of this running in production. So this specific pipeline, the one I show you, is right now scanning 430 AWS accounts that are split in 66 teams. It's connecting to these accounts, it's retrieving EIPs and DNS records, and we basically generate around 60,000 assets. But half of them, 49% of them, are scannable. Scannable in this context means that they can be resolved to a public IP. If it's a public IP, it's direct. If it's a DNS record, we do the resolution. And if it's a public IP, we take it. If not, we filter it out. At least for this use case is what we want. And I can tell you, our users have not inserted 30,600 assets manually. So since the first time we ran it, we got a lot of new assets that actually, we started scanning them and we found vulnerabilities. So you see how important it is to identify all the services you are exposing and start scanning them, start integrating this discovery into your other security processes. And I'd like to finish with some conclusions. Some things we already mentioned during the talk, but first of all is that knowing all your assets is hard. I mean, creating a full asset inventory of your organization is a hard problem. It's not easy. It's not easy in a huge organization, and it's not easy even in a small size or medium-sized organization. Because as I said, you cannot rely on a single way of discovering your assets. Maybe because you are using multiple clouds, maybe because some processes happen outside the normal pipelines, like for instance, an engineer deploying something in a secondary AWS account just for testing purposes. And sometimes because, let's say that you wanted to exploit all the events generated by AWS, sometimes you already have things that are deployed. And okay, for the new stuff, maybe it's good. But what happens with the things you already deployed in the past? Second thing is that relying on users is good. The quality of the data they will insert, they will give you will be very, very good, but they won't be able to give you all the data because it's very, very difficult. So do not only rely on users. And related to the quality of the data, it's important to mention that not all recon methods are equally trustworthy. For instance, let's say that you have this check that goes through all your AWS accounts and it gets access from inside them. It can be all the public services, all the exposed assets. It can be IAM policies. It can be whatever is there. Probably the quality of these assets you discovered is good because if they are linked to your AWS account, unless you are hosting a third party or something like that, which is not a common scenario, in this case, you are good to scan them. But if, for instance, you are using data sources that take information from Shodan, from Census, from certificate transparency, and so on, maybe these tools, they do their best to link that information they find to your organization, but it could happen that some of their guesses are not correct. So you don't want to do the same thing with all the data you find. Probably those pipelines that generate very good quality data, you want to link them. You want these workflows to send the data to your other services, like your scanning infrastructure or whatever. But those that don't generate quality data, those you want to review them manually, or maybe you want to use that data in your security reviews, in the manual ones, and things like that. Another thing that is quite obvious is that for us, we saw that having a limited read-only audit role in all our accounts was a very powerful tool because basically allows you to implement a lot of checks that provide you with good data. And of course, this is something that everybody knows, but reusability is key here. If you design the platform in a way where you have these building blocks that you can combine together in different ways and so on, you can focus on what really adds value to the organization. In the case of being a security engineer, for instance, which is creating, and I don't like the buzzword, but creating some kind of intelligence on top of these small tools that gather information and transform this into information and so on. You don't need to spend time re-implementing the same thing once and again or learning to use these libraries and so on. And very important, make it easy to contribute. So it's not only about external contributions. Many times when you are within a big team, some people in the team want to be aware of everything you are doing. So if you make it easy for them to contribute, they will probably try to fix their problems using your tooling. And probably your team is your best contributor, so take care of that. Design stuff thinking on people contributing. And well, yeah, have fun. If you create your technology in a way that is easy to deploy new experiments and so on, it will be for sure way more fun than re-implementing the same thing once and again, and many times boring stuff and so on. And with that, I think I'm done. So it's time for questions and answers.
Thank you, Roi, for your presentation as well. I captured a couple of things actually before jumping to the questions, because in the chat, in the streaming session, I haven't seen anything, but maybe while we are speaking, somebody takes the courage to drop your question there. The first thing that I like it a lot is that you emphasize the collaborative part, and we have a cultural value in our company, which is we win or we lose together, and we're all thinking on how we can enable other teams to do other things, or how we can extend the functionality of something so they can leverage it, right? So we are not thinking only in doing security, but also how we can extend the functionality for other teams as well. So thank you for sharing this collaborative part, which I also believe that it's crucial and super important. And the second thing that I just wanted to highlight is we have, I think that we read many times about the different steps that are part of an ethical hacking process, and just wanted to highlight that the first one is the recon part, right? We need to dig or to understand which are the assets that a company owns in order to try to exploit a vulnerability or to scan it or whatever, right? So the first step is knowing, and the rest of the phases are different, right? But you cannot hack what you do not know. And in the other side, from the defensive security part or pen testing within a company, you cannot protect what you do not know, right? So it's the both sides of the coin. So the recon, to do it properly, is super hard, as you were mentioning before. And I just wanted to highlight that as well. I have a couple of questions for you. The first one is, which were the challenges actually that you faced during this setup, or during developing this tool, or what learning from this project?
Mm-hmm. So I think the biggest challenge here is to tackle the aspects about the organization we were talking about at the beginning of the presentation. At the end of the day, you have a lot of services that are deployed in very different ways, and that are changing constantly. I think this is one of the biggest challenges. And then also realizing that you can not only rely on users, because maybe the first approach could be, okay, I provide the users with an API, with some kind of front end, whatever, so they can register, they can automate the registration of new hostnames and so on. But this is not that easy. It's not that easy because you cannot enforce this, and you shouldn't, because otherwise you are maybe overloading things and it makes no sense, you know. And actually, another aspect, and I think this is one of the key learnings, I would say, is that at the beginning we started with, it's called Redcon because it was something that at the beginning we were doing recon in the context of the red team, okay? So the first thing we started doing was creating tooling that was for us to use. So for instance, we started, and I think that was the first POC, with something that is called Oscar's Toolkit. Oscar is one of our colleagues, by the way, so the name is cool. And it was basically a POC that consists on a huge makefile that was running a lot of black magic in the form of shell one-liners, outputting data to files, taking these files to do other stuff, and basically you start with one file containing a set of domains, and it generates a new file, a huge one, with all the subdomains linked to those domains using several techniques, a lot of techniques. And it was cool because we started using this list to add targets to our scan queues as part of the review, right? And then we started auditing a lot of AWS accounts. So we started writing tooling for making our lives easier. But the thing is that we were generating data that was useful for us, but for sure was useful for other people, because we have a partner team that is designing a scanning platform, and they could use all this data to automate the scan of new assets and things like that. And then you say, okay, I want to use this tooling, and I want to start integrating it with our other services. But how can you do it? Because it's a shitty script you have in your machine, you know, and you just run it every now and then, and you use it as part of your review and so on. And you say, hey, I want to have it production ready. And the first thing that comes to your mind is, I will spam an EC2 instance, I will put a cron job, the shitty script will be there, and it will be being executed, generating some kind of file or pushing things to a repo, and well, they can take it from there. But this is actually not a solution, because if you want people to use it, if you want people to exploit the data you're generating or improving the quality of the data, they need something that is production ready for real. I mean, and this, I think this was a bit of the evolution of the whole thing, from something that we were using just in the context of the red team, and that's why it's called Redcon, to something that can be used out of that context and can provide good quality information to other services. So yeah, I think this was also key. And hopefully I answered your question. I think this is the most important thing.
Yeah, you did. Thank you for that. Actually, I had one last question, but then I was checking the chat and I see 2 questions from different people. So I will read them. The first one, I will not read it textually, but if we don't understand, I will read it textually, okay?
Sure,
so,
go ahead.
The question is how the communication between containers and the workflow works. So
okay.
How is it an HTTP request handled by Argo, or how is the communication there?
So here you have several options, okay? One option is, so long story short, Argo does it for you, transparently.
TLDR.
This is the TLDR. Now the details, because those are important. There is, well, good and bad things there. So the first thing is that you can use a standard input, standard output. If you use a standard input, standard output is automatic. It will use some, it will add this input and output to the metadata of the pods, and then the next step can read this information and can use it as input. But you have a limitation, which is how much data you can send from one step to the next one. And given that you are doing recon, and probably you are generating lists of thousands of things, for instance, thousands of DNS records and things like that, I don't know if it's 500K, but you will run out of the space very, very quickly. So you have a second option, which is using artifacts. And for using artifacts, which is what we are using in these demos, for instance, you basically create an S3 bucket, and can be, actually it supports a lot of data stores, but we are using S3 because we are running it in AWS and so on. So basically you can create this bucket and say Argo, hey, I want the output of this step to be in a file, and use this file as an artifact and upload it compressed, for instance, to S3. And then the next step will be able to find this artifact and use it as input. So when we create, and this is, well, I'm getting into the details, but I think it's kind of cool. So basically, when we create our tooling for Red, what we do is to create 2 modes. So basically, you have CLIs that allows you to exploit information from several sources, AWS or whatever. And it has one mode, which is for users, which is just a normal CLI with, it's user-friendly, let's say, a normal one. And then you have a mode which is for the workflows. And in that case, it will get the input from the standard input or from a file, and it will output the output. Well, you know, it will write the output to a standard output or a file, depending on your needs. Okay. And actually, we created modifiers for implementing this kind of stuff. So if you are generating a lot of information, you can split it, automatically uploading it to S3 and taking it from there. But, and this is, I want to stress something. and is that all this S3 thing is just an implementation detail, because when you are implementing your building blocks, you don't need to think of this. It's on a different layer, let's say. Hopefully this answers the question.
I think yes. If you didn't, I'm reading still the chat. So let's see if it is clear or not. But meanwhile, we have another question which is super interesting actually. And the question is, when we are doing the discovery, the question is, are we applying any asset classification to the different assets that we are discovering? Which is, do we weight them into something, criticity, severity, business impact, or anything like that?
So as part of the discovery pipeline, no. Okay, the discovery pipeline is very simple, and it will take some inputs and it will generate outputs. Of course, you could add some kind of metadata to the output saying, okay, I consider this critical because whatever, or I consider this is good quality because whatever. But what is true is that then in the sink, when you are sending this data to your asset inventory, if you, for instance, are using AWS accounts as a source of information, and you are able to classify these AWS accounts, saying, hey, this is this AWS account contains critical services and things like that, you can use this information, mix it together and say, hey, if these assets I'm finding comes from an account that we consider critical, then they are critical. But basically, you can do whatever you want in the workflow. It's just a set of steps. And actually, Argo, what we are using internally is an Argo workflow that is provided as a managed Argo workflow that one of our platform teams were creating for our data teams, because they need a platform to run their data jobs. And this running these jobs usually means to deal with huge amount of data, and also sometimes it takes time to process this data. And that's why we thought initially that this could fit our needs. Given that in AWS Lambda we had limitations, for sure these limitations wouldn't be in this other setup. And what I mean is that in the same way you are creating the workflows this way, you can add additional steps that enrich the data, saying, hey, given this criteria, I classify it as that. One criteria that comes to my mind, in the case of this example, is pretty obvious, is that using the classification you already have of your accounts to classify also the assets you find in those accounts.
Yeah, and I think I wanted to stress again this, right, that this is the recon part. So the idea is to get understanding about the different assets that are there live, that we can later on either scan or exploit or whatever other phases that we can have during the ethical hacking process or the vulnerability assessment process, right?
Yeah, actually, many times it's impossible to classify them because you don't even know what they are.
Exactly, that's the thing. The idea is to discover as much as we can, so then we can apply some criteria to what we found, right? So this will be more or less the process here.
Yeah, and it's very important also that this is a good example of how good is to integrate different services you have internally, because maybe this recon stuff doesn't have enough information to provide this risk classification, but if you connect it with your inventory, your scan platform or whatever, maybe the information is there and you can enrich the data there. It's like some kind of feedback loop, let's say, because then you have more data that you can use to discover more stuff and so on.
Exactly. I hope that our answer was clear. I don't know if we confused more people. Hopefully we can see some feedback in the chat. Meanwhile, I will jump to this my last question, which is, I like this tool, but the question for you will be, what are the plans? Are you open sourcing it? Will you be sharing this with the community, with the security community?
So I think that's actually a very good question. For sure, we are considering to open source it. Maybe right now is not the moment, but for sure it's probably in our plans, or at least we will evaluate if it's possible or not. And how I see it is that what we would open source is a repo with all these workflows, with all the checks, and with a simple way, as the one I was describing, for users to send new checks, new workflows that can be then tested in Travis and so on. And then you can deploy these workflows wherever you want, because this is important. And I forgot to mention it during the talk. And is that we are talking about Argo, but actually the building blocks, those are agnostic to the workflow technology you are using, because our simple programs will take inputs and outputs that nothing have to do with the workflow. So if you want to re-implement so take these building blocks and deploy them in a different workflow solution or orchestrator, you are just fine.
Yeah. So yeah, good. So hopefully we can, in our GitHub, in our Adevinta GitHub repository, we can put this tool and make it available for all the people. If you like to,
yeah. Actually, I forgot to say that in the talk we were mentioning Vulkan, which is this scanning platform, and actually Vulkan is already open source. So we are open sourcing our stuff. Specifically, it's the core components of Vulkan are open source. I'm sure more parts will follow. But if you want to deploy it, you can go, as Mariano said, to our Adevinta's GitHub organization and check it out.
Yep. So I think that will be it, because I don't see anything else in the chat. I think that Diana will be jumping in at any moment. Just thank you so much, Roi, for your presentation.
Thanks a lot.
Team as well. Great presentations we had today. To the audience as well, thank you so much for joining, for the questions. That's it for today, actually. Diana, I don't know if you are here. I think no. This is the good thing about live meetups and stuff like that.
Maybe you can sing a song. Yeah.
Will go wrong, you know. But it seems that Diana left me kind of alone here. Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you so much.